I am Terry Gordon, the senior editor at the New English Review, and I'm here with my colleague, Brigadier General, retired U.S. Army, John Adams. And this is our seventh SITREP talking about not only the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, but the escalating war across the Middle East, tagged and frankly fomented by the mullahs in Tehran, in Iran. So let's begin, as we normally do, General, with your blessing for the IDF, for Sahel.
May God bless all the soldiers who are fighting for all of us wearing Sahel uniforms today on both the northern and the southern front and at sea. May God bless Israel. May God bless the people of Israel, and may God say offer a special blessing for the families of hostages who are victims of the October 7th attack. Our hearts are with Israel as we speak about these issues, which are so important to the world.
Right.
Thank you, Jerry.
Let's start with the latest news regarding the so-called hostage release proposal that looked like it was dead on arrival, to be quite honest about it. So why did Bibi reject the latest Hamas ceasefire and hostage release proposal, which was going to extend over 135 days? No one in his right mind who's in the midst of a existential battle for survival in any conflict is going to permit that under the current circumstances. So was Bibi correct in saying no dice, guys?
He was, and the term that was used in the government of Israel's release was this is a delusional proposition, and I completely agree with that. I also like that instead of responding directly to the proposal, other than to say it was delusional, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that, why don't we put pressure on Qatar? Let's do that because they're facilitating this whole back and forth delusional proposal idea. So it's untenable, first of all, and you hinted at that. The notion of a months-long ceasefire, evacuation of IDF soldiers from Gaza would only allow the same malicious actors, Hamas terrorists, to regroup, rearm, and initiate operations again. And they haven't even stopped now. They still are sending rockets into the Israeli towns outside of Gaza. They get out of their tunnels and launch rockets and then go back in, and sometimes they get caught and killed, but they're still firing and they're still holding hostages. There's no sense that these are people who are ready to surrender. The attack continues. We can consider holding innocent hostages as an act of war in itself. So they're not giving up. They're not even they're no indication that they want to stop fighting. And given that, that's why this proposal is dead on arrival. But on the good news side, why would you propose, or why would you accept a proposal to stop in the middle of the operation when the operation itself is succeeding? By all accounts, the IDF is cleaning up Khan Younis as we speak. They've eliminated, the Israelis say, and I have no reason to doubt their statistics, despite what the U.S., some people in the U.S. say, oh, they've only killed a third. How do they know? I mean, I've worked in battle damage assessment myself. You just don't know, and so we're looking through the filter of IDF reporting and saying, no, they're wrong. They've only killed a third. IDF says they've destroyed 18 out of 24 Hamas battalions. Last time I checked, that's a lot more than a third, and that's also after 4 months of combat. So they've conducted operations that have reduced Hamas to 18 out of 24 battalions. And the best estimate I've seen from the IDF is there's 4 battalions left in Rafah when they go in. I don't know about the other 2. Those numbers don't quite jive, but we're talking about a large majority of Hamas has been disrupted, and not only disrupted, but killed. Logistics operations are disrupted. Command and control is disrupted, and so they're still fighting, but they're really getting close. The IDF's getting very close to wiping out the organized Hamas resistance in Khan Younis, and they're just getting started on Rafah. So, of course, they're going to reject a Hamas proposal that essentially tells the IDF, give up. You can't kill us, but in fact, they are killing them.
The IDF estimates there may be less than 80 hostages alive of the 139 original group captured by Hamas on October the 7th. And the question is, do you think that both Sinwar and the hostages may have already been secreted out of Gaza? That's a rather heretical question, but what's your thought?
I think it's unlikely because the Israelis have such good surveillance over the entire area. There was a small restriction on their surveillance during the late November hostage release when they agreed to stop aerial surveillance over Gaza for, I think, 5 or 6 days. But that doesn't mean they did. And they'd be foolish to do that because they can fly high altitude drones and Hamas would never know. And they can also fly from both the east and west of Gaza and do slant reconnaissance into Gaza. So the GAZANS or the Hamas would never know. But I think it's unlikely that either Sinwar himself and his high echelon commanders or the hostages were secreted out of Gaza. It's possible, but it's not very likely. We know that Egypt is just as interested in keeping Hamas from getting into Egypt as Israel is interested in keeping them in Gaza. So I think it's unlikely. However, I do think that it's possible that Sinwar is dead. I mean, the kind of, and unfortunately, the hostages, many of them may have been killed in combat operations too, unintentionally and lamentably. But the combat operations are combat operations, and incidents where targets are hit and unintentionally provide collateral damage, and the collateral damage may be, I think it'd be great if Sinwar, for example, could be captured alive. I don't know if it would be a good idea to keep him alive, but it would be great to capture him alive, if nothing else, for the biometric data. But I think it's possible he's been killed, and with the kind of destruction that the IDF has put on trying to get to him, it may be that he's dead. I think more likely is he's alive. They have this tunnel complex, which is apparently massive, something that's really never been seen before, not even in Vietnam, but this is beyond something the world has ever seen. Their ability to construct this warren of tunnels is massive. So yes, it's possible that they've moved out of Gaza. Unlikely. Yes, it's possible that he's been killed. It's more likely that he's still trying to figure out how to survive in the tunnels.
Yet the possibility has been raised of an interesting offer that you and I talked about going back to 1983, when Yasser Arafat and the PLO forces were surrounded by the Israelis, and they were offered a escape hatch to go to Tunis, where they stayed for a while before they came back after the accords were executed. But in any case, question is, Israel is interested in that proposition for a couple of reasons. One of them is the fact that if you offered remaining Hamas fighters and or leaders safe haven in some place like Qatar, for example, that means you're seeking instantaneous release of the hostages in the exchange. What's your thought on that?
Well, I think that given the most recent proposals from Hamas, that's not on the table. But if there were a realistic possibility of discussions and a good proposal from Hamas, a proposal that makes sense, it's in this world, then the exile idea probably would be on the table. And I'd be surprised if that's not been discussed. Between the Mossad chief, the Shabak chief, the Qataris, the Egyptians, the U.S. and Hamas leadership in Qatar. I'd be surprised if it hasn't been discussed, but I don't think, given Hamas complete intransigence, that that's something that's on the table right now.
Biden administration persists in calling for the removal of IDF forces from Gaza at the conclusion of Operation Swords of Iron and the establishment of Palestinian Authority control. Why does Israel oppose this day after U.S. proposal, and what alternative does it really have an interest in?
There's an overarching logical reason why the Israeli government does not want to talk about the day after proposal. And I think that is because we don't know what the day after will look like from a military perspective. And if they make the assumption, and I think the assumption is that Hamas is eliminated. I don't think that's an assumption that most of these, let's talk about the day after, make. What I'm hearing from not only pro-Hamas, overtly pro-Hamas, but also from Anthony Blinken, from the National Security Advisor, from the negotiator David Hochstein in Lebanon. What I'm hearing is that eliminating Hamas is not an option, that it can happen, and that we have to assume that you can't do that. I don't make that assumption. I think the Israeli government and the IDF are well on their way to eliminating Hamas as a force in Gaza. So Gaza will not have Hamas. They may have people who are nostalgic about Hamas and let them sleep away, but the so-called day after discussion is making an assumption that Israel will not be successful in eliminating Hamas in Gaza, which I think is a wrong assumption. So why does Israel oppose that day after discussion? Because they're adjusting the situation on the ground as we speak. And the day after discussion necessarily depends upon what's the situation on the ground. So I understand why Israel wants to push out that discussion. I understand why they don't want that discussion to be between the New York Times and other media that are trying to get into the periphery of a sensitive negotiation, because the New York Times as a leading media, I'm not picking on just the New York Times, but they have a pretty large voice within the U.S. media for sure. But I think that the people who are around that discussion are aching to get in and get any piece of information about the negotiations. And the best thing that Israel can do is put the kibosh on letting the press into the negotiation. In other words, the more discreet they are, the more back channel they are, the better off they are. And the greatest or one of the greatest problems is the media, but the other great problem is the United States government. We're always speculating about what's next, and we send a message to the government of Israel. We do it in the papers, we do it in public announcements, and Israel, they're just going, what the hell are we trying to do? We need to have discrete back channel discussions about these sensitive issues, about the hostages, about the day after, about military support. And the more open those discussions are, the more opportunity there are for miscreants and malcontents to get involved in it. Let's let the government, our government and the Israeli government discuss these these very sensitive items discreetly behind closed doors. That's where it needs to be.
How realistic is the assertion by the Biden administration about handing over control of Gaza to the Palestinian Authority in the context of a two-state solution? Isn't that myopic?
I think myopic is a very mild term to use for it. I would say insane, because the Palestinian Authority and Hamas have almost identical interests. The objective of both the Palestinian Authority and Hamas is to kill Jews and eliminate Israel. That's what they do. And the best way to describe, or the best evidence of that, is the Palestinian Authority pays prisoners in Israeli jails who have killed Israelis, pay for slave fund so that they can support their families. Really? They're supporting terrorism and terrorists directly, and they have for years. So I think allowing the people who have that kind of a regime in place to take over in Gaza would be like replacing a terrorist with a red hat with a terrorist with a blue hat. Why would anybody agree with that idea? They're both there. It'd be one terror for another. So I think there are potential ideas for, and this applies to the misguided notion of we don't care what Israel says about a two-state solution. We're going to recognize Palestine as it is. This was the proposal that the New York Times published just the other day. I think it was last week, I think. We need to get on with it and recognize a Palestinian state and let Israel figure out how to deal with it. Let's ask the Israelis. Oh no, let's not ask them, because they'll say no. Of course. But to talk about how the Palestinian Authority would apply itself to governance in Gaza is a complete dead end.
I'd like to go back in history as a comment about these public discussions on the day after. I recall writing back in 2005 a piece called Balagan. Balagan is
Chaos.
a great Israeli slangy word which means chaos and screw up. And it was in the context of evacuation of 10,000 Israelis who had produced productive settlements in what is now North Gaza. And it was such a heart-rending forced transfer, initiated by none other than Aric Sharon and his security people, who said, by withdrawing from Gaza, we're going to assure security for Israel. And what happened in the wake of that horrible event was that within less than a year, Hamas was in there, defenestrated essentially the PLO, and sent them packing, and essentially took over in less than a year. And they did it through a so-called democratic election of the Palestinian Legislative Council.
Democracy.
Okay. So with that in mind, I want to go to what the crux of the problem that we have and the conundrum that Washington and other capitals of the world are when they talk about keeping this war from escalating, which it already has effectively. And it concerns a stunning discovery that was made in Gaza by the IDF, indicating that it was a direct connection with Iran that provided Sinwar with $157 million in cash. Some of that, obviously, a tenth of that may have been lining his own pocket and that of his family's. So where did Iran get all this money from to essentially fund Hamas and the other proxies in the Middle East? Where did it come from? You got
Well,
any answers?
we see that. I mean, we know that huge millions of dollars of oil revenue were coming into Iran, and we, the United States, facilitate that because we want to keep oil prices low. Well, let's make up our minds here. Do we want to provide funds to Iran so that they can do their mischief all over the world? Because it's not just in the Middle East, it's all over the world, in our hemisphere as well. Iran is supporting terrorists everywhere in the world where there is a Muslim population. They use that as cover for their malicious activities. Who knows what they're doing in Michigan? We don't know, because we're like turning a blind eye as we see to the malicious activities of Hamas sympathizers in Dearborn and Detroit, Michigan, our country. The money's coming from Iran, and the money goes to Hamas from Iran and has gone since 2005. And probably before that, there was probably organization to use this as an opportunity for Hamas. And they're doing the same thing in Lebanon. They're doing the same thing in Yemen. They do the same thing in Iraq and Syria, of course, because it's all about Iran is behind all of this. But
Well,
I think oil revenues is probably a big part of it, and money is fungible. So the fact that they have it, they can put it anywhere they want.
but they're also engaged in the drug rackets,
Oh yeah,
particularly Hezbollah and Iran itself. There are estimates of at least $1 billion profits for drug running activities are in the coffers of Hezbollah, and potentially maybe also funding the activity itself in their other proxies. But there's another area that we are culpable for, and that's the release of tens of billions of dollars since the onset of the phony nuclear deal that was struck by the Obama administration in 2015. And more recently, the near release of what was it, $6 billion?
for humanitarian purposes.
Yes, correct. And it was only at the last minute that supposedly those bucks were sanctioned. So, it's a combination of total myopia on the part of the regime in Washington, if I use that analogy, and it's also essentially giving away the crux of trying to cut off the drug trade, as well as essentially profit making activities that Iran has, for example, with Russian oil.
Yeah, that's a good point. Absolutely.
Moving along with mentioning Hezbollah, I want to address what's happening in Lebanon, because fundamentally there are 80 to 100,000 Jews who've been evacuated from all of their villages in the north, and Hezbollah keeps daily sending over rockets. Israel keeps making attacks against Hezbollah positions, trying to force the Red One essentially to get back beyond the Litani line. And yet here we are having Amos Hochstein negotiating a border between, and that's it's dead.
Let us hope that his efforts are somehow successful. It would be good to do through diplomacy what otherwise will have to be done militarily.
Right.
But the IDF they're up to their eyeballs right now in Gaza and the West Bank. And they're trying to keep things at a low boil in the West Bank too, and also in Hezbollah land in Lebanon. But they have plans, and when their operational width, their operational band space or bandwidth is available. If these attacks continue, I have no doubt the IDF will turn to getting the Hezbollah forces back at least beyond the Litani River, so they can't launch rockets and missiles and anti-tank missiles with a short range against the Israeli communities along the northern border with Lebanon. I have two friends who live up there. You probably do too, Jerry.
I do.
And and the place that I visited in April was a little town called Adamit. I was glad to go to an Israeli town named Adamit, but the little town of Adamit is only 3 kilometers from the border with Lebanon. And an Israeli special operations guy who lives up there took me to the border. You can see Hezbollah from the border. They're there. That's where they live. Little towns right along the border, 3 or 4 kilometers away from Adamit and other Israeli towns along the border. They get anti-tank rockets all the time. And they're not, all the villages are not completely evacuated. If they don't force the residents to leave. They allow them to stay there if they have a business or if they want to keep their farm or whatever. But they encourage, the Israeli government is encouraging their civilian population to leave the border areas because it's dangerous. But their rocket attacks go on. So my point is this: their IDF is decisively engaged in Gaza. They will be for who knows how long, until they wipe out Hamas, which they will do. But when that's over, then they will have given Amos Hochstein the opportunity to do whatever he's going to do, and other diplomatic efforts to do what it does, and the sort of retaliatory attacks that the IDF and the Israeli Air Force are doing right now to keep the Lebanese Hezbollah under a low boil. But when they initiate operations, it'll be ground, air, and sea, and they will get the Hezbollah north of the Litani River. I have no doubt that will be successful. They just don't want to do it right now.
Don't blame them, but they've also indicated that they're prepared to fight a 3-front war simultaneously. I don't know how you can keep that up economically. That's a big question mark.
It's a huge balancing act right now.
I know.
A lot of the IDF soldiers that were the 300,000 that were mobilized for October 7th have now been discharged back to their homes, so they can go to school, they can work, they can take care of their families, they can farm. They can't have 300,000 mobilized indefinitely. So whatever happens in Lebanon after Gaza is being planned as we speak, I'm sure, and refined as we speak, but it will be quick and decisive.
It also means that UN Resolution 1701 will never go into effect if this keeps up.
I think you're right about that.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Let's go look at the proxy wars of Iran, and that's the Houthis in Yemen. How effective has been the US-led coalition strikes attempting to destroy Houthi drone and ballistic missile bases in Yemen, from attacks on commercial shipping in the strategic maritime chokehold of Bab al-Mandab at the entrance to the Red Sea? How is that working out?
It's causing serious disruption of international trade because the Houthis have not stopped, because they're not deterred. The range of airstrikes that the US and UK had done starting a week ago, that was great as far as it went, but it didn't deter Iran from continuing to support the Houthis. It caused Iran and some of the agreements like Taib, Hezbollah, and Iraq to say, "Oh, we're not going to do anymore." Well, they're still doing it, so it hasn't worked. It's not deterred. How do you get deterrence? I think you have to kill the head of the snake or hurt the head of the snake, and that would be Iran. I thought it was great that they conducted a strike against one of the leading commanders of Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, in downtown Baghdad at 10 o'clock at night. They took out his SUV. That's the hallmark of CIA operation done with a Predator or a Reaper drone. Little collateral damage. Just take that thing out. Good. But that sends a message to them, like, we can kill your leadership. But it sends a message to us as we watch this: is do more of that. Kill some IRGC commanders. Don't kill the platoon leader. Kill the brigade commander, the guy who's given directions, the Iranian who's all behind this. We killed an Iraqi. Oh, okay. Do you think that Iraqi is particularly highly valued by Iran? He's a tool. They'll get a new tool. But it's, I'm happy we're doing these strikes and it shows capability, but we're not deterring anybody. That's the problem.
How about those Iranian naval vessels providing intelligence for the Houthi to undertake attacks against what we're talking about? Shouldn't they be taken out?
Yes, they should be. They're providing direct support to people that are trying to kill our soldiers and sailors, and they're succeeding. We've taken casualties, deaths, many casualties actually, but I think they should be fair target. And a lot of other Americans who are watching this are urging the administration to take more decisive action. I think there's a reason that they're not doing it. They say they're sending a message to Iran: we don't want to start a war with you. They're also sending a message to the region saying, we don't want to disrupt the possibility of a comprehensive peace plan to be revealed between now and our elections, because there is discussion, and it's reached the New York Times. Tom Friedman wrote an article about this a week and a half ago. The Biden administration has a vision for the Middle East, and it's big. And the idea is to get everybody together and make a big announcement. And whether or not Israel agrees with a two-state solution, the Biden administration is going to announce this. They're going to involve Saudi Arabia. They're going to involve Egypt and Jordan. I'm not sure they're going to involve Iran. In fact, I'm sure they won't. But they know that if they have a hot war with Iran, that can't happen, because they'll heat things up. So that's not a possibility. I think that's what's going on. I think that this has to do more with, at least as much with domestic U.S. politics as it does with the Middle East. And that I find disgusting.
Those B-1 bombers that did the attack in Yemen, Iraq, and other locations also have the range and the capabilities to fly underneath radar and should be able to attack Iran itself. And the reason I bring that up is it's quite clear that Iran is very, very close to weaponization of the enriched uranium stock that they have. They've obviously nefariously impeded the work of the International Atomic Energy Agency from taking a look at what's going on in those whirling dervishes known as centrifuges there. And we have a pretty good idea that Iran probably has already enough stock of enriched uranium to make perhaps half a dozen nuclear devices of whatever nature in doing that stuff. So all the talk about essentially a giant global peace plan, sort of the Abrahamic Accords written wide, is totally unrealistic if you are not the strong horse in the Middle East. if you do not demonstrate that you have the capability of doing something more than tit-for-tat attacks, much like is going on against the Houthi, you're not going to have any demonstrable credibility for the Saudis, Jordanians, the Egyptians, as a case in point, who we consider as nominal allies, and the Bahrainis. But the Bahrainis, as you and I have discussed previously, have good reason to be an ally. They've got the Fifth Fleet sitting out there, probably keeping their restive Shia population restive, so to speak. But realistically, at this point, there has to be a concerted program to address regime change in Iran.
Let's hope. We are whistling past the graveyard, so to speak. We know that if Iran explodes a nuclear device, the situation changes completely. Talk about a day after. That would be the day after. And that would change the ground. Just like I mentioned before, one reason why Israel doesn't want to talk about the day after in Gaza, because they're working on setting this stage for a productive day after without Hamas. And then we can talk about a day after Hamas. But Iran is working on their own version of a day after they blow a bomb. And that will change everything, as you just outlined. Calculations will change. We won't be talking about retaliatory actions anymore. We'll be talking about how do we avoid a nuclear war.
Right.
There's a couple of things that we can do in advance of that that we're not doing now. I mean, attacking the Houthis and the Kataib, Hezbollah, and even Hezbollah itself or Hamas isn't going to stop the Iranians from developing a nuclear weapon. But what might work would be initial military action against Iran. We've got strategic bombers that can hit them. We could take out their oil refineries. We could set them back months, if not years, economically. That might have the right effect. We can let them know that if they continue to work on the bomb, we're going to take out their nuclear facilities. And we should not ask the Israelis to do that. Well, the Israelis have said they won't allow Iran to get a bomb, and I believe them. I'm sure the Israeli Air Force has proposed operations to do that. But we're the strategic power. We're supposed to have their back. Let's keep this devil from arising in the Middle East. We can't let Iran have the bomb, and they're going to get the bomb if we don't do something. So I think that we are just, again, whistling past the graveyard, waiting for another day after, not the day after Gaza, but the day after Iran blows the bomb. And, I don't have a good option for that, but I think we should use military options sooner rather than later.
But there are also the kind of Mossad-like activities that could be arranged in Iran. For example, the Council of Guardians, as it's called, has a palaver coming up about who's going to be the successor to Khamenei as Ayatollah. And it seems to me that that's an opportunity to address having everybody in one bunker, essentially, that could be the basis for a target. The other is that, not unlike the Churchillian proposal of World War II, is look, Iran is composed of a number of disparate populations other than those who consider themselves as Persians. You've got the Azeris in the northwest of the country, who have a sometime ally of Israel across the border in Azerbaijan. In the southeast of the country, you've got the Balochs, who in the midst of the turmoil in Pakistan have really undertaken pushback against the Chinese presence, by the way, in South Asia. And fundamentally, you have other groups, including Sunni Arabs in the southwest of Iran, who basically, whose province controls where the platforms are located.
Who's a state?
For distribution stuff.
Yeah.
So there is no concerted strategic plan to do either a combination of military, but also other actions, not unlike what Churchill proposed for the Special Operations Executive to essentially have captive nations rise in concerted actions against the Nazi occupation. Well, I consider the Ayatollahs to be the jihadist equivalent of the Nazis in many ways. And that's what's really missing. There is no strategic vision on the part of this US government, and I don't know if any other ones at this juncture, that has that depth of experience and essentially could engage in an exercise to essentially eliminate the jihadists and the Shia Salafists from power. And why do I say that? I had the opportunity at one point, way back in 2011, to take a ride with several people who were going to a CPAC episode. And the cab driver was an expat Iranian who left, who said, yes, he has family back there. But he also said, you've got to get rid of essentially the mullahs. He said when he was growing up under the Shah, only you went to the mullahs to get married or to bury relatives. Other than that, they had nothing to do with them in that regard. So the whole Islamic revolution that occurred way back in February of 78, 79, essentially threw that out. And yet, the 84 million Iranians of whatever stock were desperate to make peace with Israel and the United States.
That would be a wonderful development for us.
For
but
us.
Also for us.
Correct.
It'd be good for Iran. Their people would be free.
Yep.
Or at least have the opportunity to be free. I have no illusions that their government would develop in a necessarily positive direction, but at least it wouldn't be extreme Muslim or radical Islamic.
Right.
But it'd be good for Israel, of course, because Iran is the absolute. All they want to do is destroy Israel. So let's hope that happens.
Right. But if you don't do anything strategic to prevent that from happening, and which is really what we're in right now, then you can't avoid that. And that's the sorrowful situation we have of our national security policy at this point in time for the Middle East.
I couldn't agree more. Our national security policy is so confused and counterproductive. It opposes itself. It's not even integrated, and we see that at the top with our unfortunately confused president. We know he's confused. He's said so last night in his extemporaneous press conference. Mexico is not Egypt. We know that. And nobody even people. I think people were actually, although the press was pretty hard on him last night, nobody said anything. The other day they offered him a hint when he couldn't remember the name of Hamas. They said one of the press people said Hamas, and he said, "Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry, Hamas." But he doesn't know what he's doing from moment to moment. Really, it's so sad. But there are smart people who work for him that are like, I think that he's probably getting his domestic policy from Susan Rice. He's probably getting his foreign policy from Antony Blinken. He's not thinking through anything. But strategically, though, we're so confused, and our policies are not making any sense. I think you're right. I think what you're saying is that, and I agree with it completely, that we're actually making it difficult for Iranian populations to rebel against their government. We're making it hard. We're not helping. I'm sure there's discussions going on. I know the CIA is probably doing what it can. We probably have joint ops with Mossad. We should, but it's not. And of course, we're not going to know if they're successful. But we see no evidence of it. We don't see the Baluchis rising up against the government of Iran. The Baluchis could do some serious damage in Iran.
They have.
Because they're away from the major population centers. It would be tough for the government of Iran to put down a Baluchi, since really effective counter attack against Iran. But we could support that. We could. The U.S. could support that. We shouldn't ask Israel to do everything. We should let Israel focus on what's going on in their borders right now. But I was struck last night when President Biden had his press conference to talk about this classified information that he apparently revealed, that somebody asked him a question and it got under his skin about Gaza. He didn't use that as an opportunity in any way to condemn Hamas.
No.
He said nothing about how this started. He didn't talk about Iran. He didn't talk about Hamas. He talked about how hard he personally worked with the president of Mexico to open the gates for humanitarian aid to Gaza. Guess who opened the gates to get humanitarian aid to Gaza? The Israelis did, not Biden. The Israelis have been talking about that from the very beginning. At first they cut it off, but then they decided about a week after that, we got to provide some humanitarian support. Biden, that wasn't his thing. And then at the same time as he's talking about his foreign policy in Gaza, completely ignoring the fact that this whole mess was started by Iran and Hamas, he's putting pressure on Israel to do more than they already do. He's not reading his own counterterrorism experts like John Spencer from the Institute of Urban Warfare at West Point, which has the mandate in our Defense Department to look at the topic of urban warfare. And John Spencer is an expert, and he says IDF is well within the operations of international war, international humanitarian considerations, the laws of war. John Spencer is fulsome about how he would support the Israeli operations in Gaza. And he even brought up a comparison with what we did, the United States did in Mosul 15 years ago,
Right.
where we fought a much smaller enemy. We fought in a small space, a small urban space. We didn't have to deal with tunnels. It took us 4 months to clean it out and stop the action. I'm sure they didn't clean it out, but they at least made the attacks go away. Israel has got a much bigger task on its hands. John Spencer is impressed with the IDF operations. But I guess I'll finish by saying how totally discordant and really completely schizophrenic in its policies towards this war, both foreign and domestic. I talked about our policy toward Israel and criticizing them for not providing humanitarian operations, which is not true. But also, even in our own country, where we really do have a serious problem with anti-Semitism, not just on campuses, but in cities where Jews are being attacked on the street. A Jew who wears a kippah can be physically attacked on the street, and the perpetrators get away with it. So I discount any serious effort on the part of the administration to fight anti-Semitism. They say the right words sometimes, but they're not taking any action because it continues. It continues, and at the same time as they're making a very weak effort to combat anti-Semitism in our country, in our own country, the Biden administration is courting overt supporters of Hamas by inviting them to the White House.
Well, I'd like to address that
Please
because
do.
before the attack, just before the attack in Gaza, I was asked to give a program on anti-Semitism at a local church here, a liberal church, I might add. And I went through a discussion about the adoption of the international human rights definition of anti-Semitism. And then I referred to a document that had been prepared by a combination of folks, but led by the special envoy for anti-Semitism, who I had the occasion when she was up at Yale University about a decade ago to talk about the same subject as well. Courageous gal who stood up to a Holocaust denier at her trials in London. And at the same token, the White House mushed together anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And they brought on board essentially U.S. fronts for the Muslim Brotherhood, the Council of American Islamic Relations, to be part of this mushed group to deal with both problems in this regard. And then, as you cited earlier, the president was out, trying to convince the UAW hierarchy, labor union hierarchy, to support his campaign in November, has to go nip down to Dearborn, Michigan, to mollify the mayor, who is an ardent Shia Muslim. And not many Americans realize that the largest mosque in the U.S. is located in Dearborn, Michigan. How did Shia Muslim families get to Dearborn, Michigan? They were brought over by Henry Ford to work as assemblymen way back in the first decade or so of the 20th century. But you're right. Those Shia harbor radicals who have direct connections with Iran. And yet, here is the president trying to cultivate them to prevent their disaffection from pulling the lever in November to vote for him. Because there's something like 176,000 essentially scattered throughout the state of Michigan in this regard. And so the U.S. is really caught on the horns of a dilemma. At the same time, they want to support the Jewish state of Israel, but the reality is here, they will do anything politically to essentially prevent the election of an alternative, largely because they don't want to lose votes at the margin. This is no way to handle national security implications, none whatsoever.
You and I are complete accord on that.
Yep.
As a soldier, as soldiers, that's we can, of course we're interested in politics because there is an overlap, but the most important thing for me and for you is national security.
Right.
And just as we're concerned about Israel because it's our best ally, I'm concerned about Israel because it has a direct impact on my national security. So I want to see us do something in our own interest. I want to see us take national security decisions that will keep the United States safe, keep our allies safe, and keep us from having an unnecessary war, which right now we've got a couple going on that they're unnecessary. We don't need them. We're not making smart decisions. We're confused and conflicted, and it starts apparently right here at home.
Yep. And with that, I thank you for another engrossing discussion on the expanding, escalating war with the U.S. faltering to develop a coherent policy.
Thank you, Jerry, it's a privilege to collaborate with you. May God bless Israel and the IDF.